Hey guys, so the question of could I use an iPad Pro as my primary work machine has been addressed quite a bit on YouTube, but I feel like a lot of those videos are, in some cases, established Mac users that are already really used to the ecosystem doing it, or somebody who only uses it for part of the day and it's pretty clear that they're still using other devices for other things. So I wanted to kind of come at this from the perspective of a lifelong Windows and Android user who only recently has been dipping his toe into the Apple ecosystem out of curiosity, and who owns a Surface Pro 7 as his regular computer. And so for me, going into this is, if I'm using this, which is a tablet of pretty similar overall size, what is the difference in workflow and usability of apps and peripherals and whatnot of using the iPad Pro? So I decided that for a week to a week and a half, I would exclusively use only my iPhone and the iPad Pro to run every facet of my life, personal and professional. Now, there's a ton that I could say about the iPad, and in the interest of time for this video, which I might cover more things in another one, I'm going to delve into two main areas that affect, for me, how viable this is as a professional work machine. One, what is the UI like and how does it handle peripherals? And then two, what are the apps and the workflow nature of the operating system like? So we can't talk peripherals without talking about connectivity ports. Something that I do really like about the Surface Pro, apart from its inconveniently placed power plug location that always ends up causing the cable to bend unnecessarily, but other than that, I love that it has two USB ports, both a USB-C and a USB-A. I find that 2 seems to be the magic number for a tablet, which is to say, almost all the time. 2 ports are enough for me to have, say, one peripheral like a mouse or maybe an external hard drive, and then I've got that one extra port that I could do something like plug in a USB microphone or some other needed peripheral, and I never really seem to need more than that. I've only used a USB hub on the Surface, I think once or twice, in the year that I've had this particular one. Now the iPad Pro, of course, only having one USB-C port that covers everything, charging, peripherals, etc., does make that a little bit more challenging. Yes, using a Bluetooth mouse and keyboard alleviates a lot of that for your main peripherals that you're going to use all the time, but I did find that I have to use a USB hub if I'm trying to charge it and use a hard drive or a microphone like I'm doing now at the same time. It's not a huge deal. It affects portability a little bit, but as a pro device, we're probably using this at a desk for a lot of those kind of tasks anyway, so it's not a huge deal, but it is worth commenting. Something that I hope that they change on a subsequent model of the iPad Pro would be to make it a little bit more like the MacBook Pro that I know has at least 2 USB-C ports. And I feel like if they put 2 on the iPad Pro, it would be that perfect balance again. If you would have one port for power or whatever, and then the other for a major peripheral that you're using at any one time. One more port would really make a difference in connectivity. Don't know how likely Apple is to do that since they seem like they're on a rampage to eliminate ports lately, but who knows. So let's talk about the peripherals themselves. Using a keyboard is a pretty good experience. I didn't really have any major issues with a Logitech Bluetooth keyboard that I've been using, and I did discover an easy way to overcome one pain point that I had, which is, in Windows, of course, you use the Control key for shortcuts like Control-C, Control-V, Control-T for new tabs, etc., and Apple wants to use the Command key, and after a few times of hitting that and it doesn't work, it gets a little frustrating, I discovered that in the settings, there's options for key substitutions, meaning I could tell it, treat the Control key as the Command key. And now for me, from a muscle memory standpoint, I can hit the Control key like I'm used to, and it carries out the same function. That's a real win. I also found that you want to turn off smart punctuation in the keyboard settings. One of the things that will do is every time you use the quotation key, instead of making the straight up and down quotes, it makes the fancy curled ones. Now, why does that matter? Well, if you're working with any kind of CSS code or anything like that in a browser, it actually doesn't count the curled quotations as valid markup, and it will break your code, something I ran into a few times. Now, if you turn smart punctuation off, it makes the quotes just the regular up and down quotes, and then the code is fine. Another thing that, if that affects you, you might want to make sure that you do. Otherwise, having a keyboard is going to be a frustrating experience for certain things. Using a mouse for the most part was a good experience, primarily after I turned off a setting that initially I'd heard a lot of people recommend that you do use. They described assistive touch as something that would really make the mouse experience better. Now, one thing having that setting on does do is makes it so that when you click and hold the mouse button down and then move the mouse up and down, it does the same thing as if you were touching your finger to the screen and flipping up and down, and you can scroll the screen. That's pretty cool to be able to do that with a mouse. But unfortunately, it makes every other aspect of using a mouse a bad experience. And the reason is, I found that the scroll wheel was really flaky with that on, and probably about 50% of all of my mouse clicks didn't count as clicks because the iPad must have thought that I was clicking to scroll instead of clicking, and then it was pretty aggravating. The minute I turned that setting off in accessibility settings, the mouse behaved much more like a mouse normally does, and it was a much better experience. Although, with the one caveat that although the scroll wheel was a little bit better with that off, I still found that I seemed to need to do a lot more scrolling to get the page to go appreciably up and down than I would with the same mice on my Surface Pro. And yes, before you ask, I did go into the mouse settings and turn the sensitivity for the scrolling all the way up to max. It helped a little bit, but it's still, you need to do a lot of scrolling. It's not a huge deal, but it is a minor gripe that definitely, if it scrolled as sensitively as you can make it on the Surface tab, would make web browsing and working in builder tools on websites a little bit less painful. So let's talk about other peripherals. There's some real surprising good parts here and some negatives. I'll get into the good parts first. So I was pleasantly surprised at the flexibility that you have with the iPad of the kinds of things you can plug into it and it just knows how to do. For instance, a USB microphone like this, you can plug right into the USB-C port or run it through a hub and it works fine. You don't need any drivers, you don't need any software, it will just use it and it sounds good. And I even discovered playing around one day, I could take my Sound Blaster X G6 USB sound card that I use as a headphone amp on my Surface Pro. I can plug that into the iPad and it just knows how to use that also. It's smart enough to pass the sound right into it. It works fine as a headphone amp. It sounds good. And I can even use a microphone out of the input port on it, and it's smart enough to do that as well. That's very cool. On PC, you need to have the full suite of Sound Blaster command software in order for the card to work properly, so it's nice to see that you don't need any software to use it on an iPad. Now, of course, without the software, you miss out on some of the fancy settings and stuff you can do, but if you're just looking for a straight headphone amp experience, works great. It seems to communicate pretty well with external devices like SD cards, with the right readers, or plugging external hard drives into it, as long as they're formatted in the exFAT format. And it reads them fine, and you can write to them, and I didn't have any issues there. The one glaring thing it's missing, I think, especially for a Pro device, is you cannot click on an external drive and format it. And so, because you need to have it in an exFAT format or the proprietary Apple format in order for it to be able to write to the drive, if you have an old external hard drive like I did that was still formatted in NTFS, well, then it's not going to work properly with the iPad, and you can't just tell the iPad, well, format it in exFAT. It can't format drives. And so Apple says, well, you need to connect it to a real computer to do that, which, fine, I had a Surface Pro, and that was the one exception in my week-long of trying to exclusively not touch the Surface for anything. It was the one thing I had to power this up for to do because there was no way around it. And I just find that unfortunate because everybody pitches the iPad Pro as you could use it as the only computer you have, and I think in a lot of ways that's true, but suppose you did do that, you don't have another computer to plug it into to format this drive. So if it's not already exFAT, what are you going to do? That seems like a really simple ask, that it's weird that it's not present as something you can do in iPad OS, and I hope in a subsequent update it's something that they add. Now, of course, once you have a drive that's properly formatted in exFAT, it's a pretty good experience, with the notable exception that despite the fact that it's Thunderbolt USB 3.2 port on it that's supposed to be super fast, I did notice that if I were to open folders on an external hard drive that were full of images and other stuff, it was able to generate all the previews for them a fair bit slower than it does on the Surface Pro. I'm not sure exactly why that is, if it's a RAM thing or if it's something else, but something worth noticing. So let's move on to the apps, the workflow, and all of that. One criticism that I saw a lot about the iPad going into this before I had used it hands-on is people saying that for a pro device, it can't actually use any of the pro tools. And I think when they said that, they were talking about Final Cut Pro for videos and the full Adobe suite and whatever, which I suppose is true. But for someone like myself, I have found that not to be an issue, and all of the apps that are available in the App Store were a perfect analog to what I was used to using in Windows. Now, for clarity, what I generally do in a workday is, yes, I do some video capture and production and editing. I need to record audio to be able to do that. I do some photo manipulation, both for the YouTube thumbnails and also for web graphics that I need to use for featured images on blog posts, things like that. But then the rest of my time, I'm largely in a browser, either blogging or writing page content for websites, or working with builder tools like Divi or Elementor. Now, I'll say about Safari that for the most part, it handles everything just as well as any browser like Firefox that I've used on the Surface Pro, with one notable exception. On the Surface, of course, you can right-click in Firefox or pretty much any other browser and say View Source when you want to look at the code behind a page. And if you're in a building or development environment and you need to see the code to troubleshoot something, it's a real bummer not to be able to do that. Now, there is a standalone app you can get for the iPad called View Source that, in a pinch, it lets you look at the code from a URL. But the problem is it only lets you look at the code. You can't do a Control F to be able to find specific parts of the code. You can't highlight or interact with the code in any way. And so it's a minor thing that I don't need all that often, but it is a thing that when I need it, not being able to do it hurts. And so that would be, I guess, another example of, for a pro device, as a web pro, it's a bummer in a way not to have that. Now, as far as the apps go, I'll give you some examples of where I mentioned the direct analog between the two. So on Windows, I use Camtasia to produce and edit my video files, and I have found that LumaFusion is a pretty good transition. The interface is fairly similar, so if you know one, it's pretty easy to jump into the other one and not have a huge learning curve, and it can do pretty much all of the things that Camtasia can do, and in a couple ways, with the sound, I think you have a few more options than you had, and it's also cheaper. I think it's $25 in the App Store for LumaFusion. I think it cost me $80 to $100 to get Camtasia when I got that, and so that's nice that it's a little cheaper. I would use Corel Photo on Windows as a cheaper alternative to Photoshop. I think it did a pretty good job, and the analog to that on the iPad is either using the free version of Lightroom or Affinity Photo, which again, layout-wise, is very familiar to Corel Photo. If you understand the one, it's very easy to jump into the other one and do pretty much everything you need. And I actually think that Affinity Photo has more options for certain things than Corel does, so that's a pleasant surprise. And once again, on the price, I think it was close to $100 or a little more than that when I first bought Corel. It's $19.99 in the App Store for Affinity Photo, so that's not bad at all. Because so much of my work is on the web, and because other than that one example of View Source, Safari does a really good job of rendering everything, I've actually been able to get by pretty seamlessly with that, and it's not been an issue on the iPad to have, 6 to a dozen tabs open at once. I don't feel like I'm running out of RAM. That was something that I was curious about when I started this, knowing that this particular iPad only has 8 gigs of RAM versus the 16 of my Surface, but I think only once I ran into an issue where an app had to refresh itself. Otherwise, I've been able to have the YouTube app, Netflix, I could have a browser with a bunch of tabs open, I could have Affinity Photo open, I could have LumaFusion open, all working on different things. And anytime I jump between any of these apps, it just goes right back to where it was, which has been really nice. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering, as a fellow Windows user, they do have all of the Microsoft Office apps available in the App Store, and if, like me, you already have an Office 365 subscription, you can download Word, Excel, or anything like that for free from the App Store, plug it in and use it right away, and it works really well. And so between all of those apps, there weren't many scenarios in that week that I used it exclusively that I ran into where I just couldn't do something, except for the couple examples that I gave. And it was a pretty good experience on the iPad. And definitely for photo and video editing, I found that that M1 chip that's in the iPad, people have been going on and on about how powerful it is, and they are not exaggerating. It's a great chip. Scrubbing back and forth in the video with a lot of effects on was definitely a lot more buttery smooth than on the Surface Pro, that while the i7 in it and all the other hardware it has is ample for a lot of things that I do with it, I have always felt for video editing like I was pushing it to its limits and really straining it. And definitely when you get to the point where you're rendering the video at the end, or say you're in Zoom calls, something with a lot of video going on, the fans kick on the Surface Pro really heavily to keep it cool. And if you put your hand on the back of it, it's hot to the touch. The iPad, on the other hand, was faster at rendering videos and smoother. It doesn't have any fans to keep it cool, and when I put my hand on the back of it, it was barely warm, doing all of those same tasks. So definitely a more efficient environment for sure, for whatever that's worth to you. Now, because I was so impressed with what the iPad Pro can do with 8 gigs of RAM, I would imagine if you had the 16 gig of RAM version of the iPad, you could do virtually anything, and it's probably a great way to future-proof it. I know a lot of people have their fingers crossed that in a subsequent update, they're going to allow you to use some of the Pro apps that you can do on Mac OS, and if they do, that 16 gigs will definitely be interesting at that point. But for anyone curious, the 8 gig is surprisingly robust of what this operating system can do with that RAM. And like I said, running a whole bunch of Pro Tools at the same time, I never really had any of them need to refresh on me and run into that frustrating scenario of you were in the middle of working on something and then it lost it. All in all, it's nice to still have a Windows computer as a backup for the few things that you cannot yet do as well on an iPad, but I am very comfortable at this point actually continuing to use the iPad as my everyday machine. I've had a pretty good experience overall with it, and there's, again, except for a couple of things that I will need to go back for the Surface to use, I think for 90% of what I do, the iPad is perfectly sufficient. And if you are less of a power user than me and you're not doing video editing or you're not doing design work and stuff, definitely this is more than powerful enough for the average user to do basically anything you could probably imagine. And of course, one last note on the ecosystem that I would like to mention is it is really nice to be able to seamlessly bounce things like your AirPods headphones between devices. I could have Amazon Music open on the iPad listening to music on them, and if my phone rang and I answered it, it would intelligently just pass the AirPods connection to the phone without my ever having to take them off, and I was in the phone call. And then I could just take them back and go back to the music. Stuff like that is really cool. And I did use AirDrop a couple of times for videos and take photos that I took on the phone to just bounce them over to the iPad. That was really handy as well. So there are some things like that that you don't necessarily get in Windows that I can appreciate about the Mac ecosystem that you really only notice once you have several Mac devices and not just an iPhone like I had originally had. Anyway, guys, throw your questions down below. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I'm planning to do at least 1 or 2 more videos about my experience with the iPad, covering it from different angles, so if you would like to hear more, stay tuned. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want more of this content, and I will see you guys in the next video.